Hey listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. A few of you have asked how you can best support this show, which I really appreciate. Here are two easy-ish things. First, be sure to follow Grief Out Loud on whatever platform you use to listen. And two, give us a rating and review on that same platform. Both of these will help the show reach more people. In fact, if you want extra credit, share an episode with someone you know. Thank you for helping us continue to be a community for those who are grieving from around the world. Today, I'm joined by Daria Burke, author of the newly released memoir, Of My Own Making. Daria's story is one of profound honesty, resilience, and healing, from the death of her maternal grandmother at age 7 to navigating childhood neglect, parental addiction, and eventually, family estrangement. What makes Daria's path so compelling is how her grief remained buried for decades, until a chance online search led her to a newspaper article about her grandmother's fatal car accident. Reading the article and seeing the photos broke open emotions she'd never processed as a child, and that opening kickstarted yet another layer of healing. In our conversation, Daria shares what it means to grieve someone who died, while also grieving relationships with people who are still alive but absent from your life. We explore the collective grief she witnessed growing up in Detroit during the 1980s, the complicated emotions of estrangement, and the beautiful ways she stays connected to her grandmother through what she calls love taps, unexpected signs and connections that appear in her daily life. Whether you're processing your own childhood losses, navigating complicated family relationships, or simply trying to make sense of grief, Daria's story offers insights we can all relate to. Daria Burke is an American writer, speaker, and well-being advocate. Her debut memoir, Of My Own Making, came out in the spring of 2025 and is a soulful and scientific exploration of overcoming adversity, healing from childhood trauma, and rewriting one's own story. As a chief marketing officer, Daria was named a 2020 Ad Age Women to Watch, whose work has been recognized by Women's Wear Daily, Forbes, Vogue, Town & Country, and The Cut. She's also written for Fast Company, The Huffington Post, and Black Enterprise, and has appeared on The Melissa Harris Perry Show on MSNBC. A distinguished alumna of the NYU Stern School of Business and the University of Michigan, Daria was born in Detroit and now calls Los Angeles and East Hampton home. Okay, here's my conversation with Daria. Daria, thanks for coming on Grief Out Loud today.
Thank you for having me.
I know I just gave your long professional bio in the intro that listeners just heard, but what feels important for you today in this moment to share with listeners? Like, what would you like folks to know about you?
Gosh, I think that I'm a seeker, just like a lot of us, that I'm someone who's come to appreciate and understand and deeply believe that healing is a practice. And I think that it's really tempting to look at anyone's exterior, the outside of their life, the rough sketch of their life, the highlight reel of their life, and think that you have some sense for how they're doing or where they come from or the way that they move through the world, that it informs something more. And sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. And I think that's been certainly my experience. My resume, I think, supports that disconnect sometimes. When people learn about my background, they can't generally understand how someone can come from where I come from and maybe wind up in a life that feels so far a departure from it. The idea, or the quote, Maya Angelou popularized it, but it comes from Tyrone from like 600 BC, that says that nothing that is human is alien to me. It's with me all the time. I think about that all the time. It allows me to be reminded that not everything we see tells the full story, and that there's absolutely nothing that another human being could go through that I couldn't possibly experience. I might not, but I could. And that also, I think, just hopefully affords all of us more grace, more compassion, more empathy. And so I think I would want people to know that also matters a lot to me.
And your memoir, your first ever book of my own making, just came out a couple days before we're recording this interview. And in it, you share so much about your life and so much about your life that you didn't share for so many years, that you really had that divide of like, here is the Daria from before, and here is the Daria now, and the two shall not engage with one another. But then there's a moment in your life where you connect back to a really early childhood loss that seems to break open this new way of telling your story or getting to know your story. And that was about your maternal grandmother who died when you were 7. It sounds like from the book she was such a caregiving force in your childhood. And I'm curious, like, what did you know to be true about your grandmother as a child?
She was. I knew very little. I was, as you mentioned, 7 years old when she passed away. And so even now, when I think about what I know about her, I often question when I learned it. So I don't know when I learned that she was from Mississippi and that she got married very young at 15 and had her first son by then, my oldest uncle, that she would go on and have two more sons and then remarry eventually and have my mother, who's the youngest and the only daughter. And so all of those facts feel so certain. I mean, they've always been things that I've known, but I don't know when I knew them, if that makes sense. She lived such an interesting life as a result of coming from where she come, she was born in the 30s in the Jim Crow South, moved with her family to Detroit and made a life as much as one can without an education and without a lot of opportunities that would have been available to someone like me now. And I didn't know those things when I was that young. I just knew that she was quite fierce and determined and sharp and kind of no nonsense, but still really loving and nurturing. And she was a faithful churchgoer and a very hard worker. She owned all the houses that her kids lived in and the one that she lived in as well. And so I think that I just had this sense that there was this formidable person who earned deep respect, but who also cared a lot about other people. And I was a very lucky beneficiary of that love and that care. But I think when you're that young and you suffer a loss, it can be so difficult to really articulate the before and the after. I think the before and the after looks mostly like what life looked like before she died, and at least what I remember of it, and then what it looked like afterwards. But she was a wonderful person. One of my favorite memories about her is that she really only wore jeans in the garden. She was that kind of woman. I certainly I do wear jeans, but I definitely get, I think, a more of a fanciness from her. She was always dressed and prepared for whatever life's events required, and that's one of the fondest things that I think of when I think of her sometimes.
Are there other ways, Daria, that you see parallels between your grandmother and yourself?
Mm. Well, I think clearly there's a capacity to overcome adverse experiences. I think to be able to imagine a future where you continue on after devastating losses, after heartbreak, after just living in difficult circumstances and conditions, being disappointed. I think there certainly I imagine share a similar relationship to despair, in that we don't entertain it for long. My grandmother was a religious woman and I am not, but I'm a very spiritual person and a very sort of faithful person, in the sense that I have always had deep knowing, and a deep feeling of being connected to something larger than myself, and feeling very much like the way that I live my life in part is a way of honoring that. And I think that she did that too. She was pretty no nonsense, as I mentioned, and I could see ways in which I might be similar to her in that regard. We obviously didn't get to form the kind of relationship that I could imagine us having as, with me, an adult, even a younger child, an older child, excuse me. But I could sort of imagine her being quite entertained by the life that I live now, impressed by it, but also proud and also feeling. I think she could see the ways in which she paved the way for that. I think that independence that she showed, being first divorced at a time where that was uncommon and then widowed after her second husband, my grandfather, passed away. She was, I think, very strong in that regard and you could always rely on her, and you knew that she always felt clear that she could rely on herself. I think that's also something that we probably have in common.
What do you remember about the day that your grandmother died? How did you hear the news?
We were at home waiting for her to pick us up for church, as she did pretty much every Sunday. My mother, my younger sister, and I had gotten dressed, gotten ready, and for a while, my sister and I were waiting, and we were sort of allowed to just watch cartoons until Grandma arrived. And I believe at the time we did have a working telephone, but we did not have a car, which was part of the reason that Grandma would pick us up. I remember we waited for a while and then it turned into a longer while. And, as kids, you sort of don't have a real concept of time. Everything feels like it's taking forever. But I remember us waiting and then waiting and waiting, and my mom starting to have a bit of agitation in that wait. And this is in 1987. There were no cell phones. People weren't able to reach each other is with the kind of access that we have now. And eventually, after some time, the phone rang, and it was someone calling from the hospital, from Henry Ford Hospital, asking if my mother was the daughter of Effie Mae Bogard, my grandmother, that she had been in a car accident, and that it was, and they didn't report then that it was fatal. They just said that it had been a quite tragic or terrible accident and that we needed to get to the hospital right away. I remember my mother running over to the next door neighbor's house and asking them to drive us to the hospital. And when I got there, I remember two, if not all three of my uncles being there in kind of a waiting area. Basically, by the time we arrived, I think they had been told that she was gone. What was shared was that she was dead on arrival, that she had died on impact with the car accident. The force was so strong that the rear of her car had been compressed and pushed her through the front windshield. So she didn't survive that. Everybody, of course, they were inconsolable, and it felt so confusing and shocking, but I didn't fully understand why and what was happening. I don't remember who told us that she had died. I don't remember knowing that I knew what that meant, but I don't remember feeling super confused about it either afterwards. It was sort of just like this thing had happened. And then I remember her funeral, which was a week later, a week or so later. I think that was when, because I saw her in the coffin, it felt more real. It was much more concrete by then. But the day that she died everyone else was in such a state of emotional distress that as a child, you're just looking, I think, for direction and kind of for feedback. You sort of don't know how to react, and you're relying on the adults around you to inform how you should react. And so I knew it was something that was really, really bad. But it took a while for it to, I think, click into place as to what that actually meant.
You mentioned, being a child and looking to the adults. Like, first, what has happened? What does this mean? And what are we supposed to do and feel about this? As the days and weeks and months and years progressed after your grandmother's death, what did you learn from the adults in your life about grief? Like what grief is, or what it looks like, or what you're supposed to do with it?
Formally, nothing. There were no conversations about how to navigate this kind of a loss as a family. There were no conversations about what do we do with the routines that are now disrupted with her absence. And I only remember the conversation about what to do with her house and who would live there and what to do with her things. I remember the logistics of her death, but I don't ever remember there being a conversation about her death. And so everything I learned about grief was by proxy. It was watching, particularly my mother, react and, in her case, sort of lose the battle with it, not being able to keep herself together. I spend a lot of time in the book trying to make sense of what I thought was the story of my life, which was that everything was great and my grandmother was very much an active co-parent in my family until she died, because my parents had been separated since I was 2 years old, and that my grandmother just stepped in and helped her daughter, who was a young mother, raise her two girls. We didn't live with her, but we saw her daily, and that was the story that I told myself for many, many years. And that it was only after grandma passed away that my mother's drug addiction began. And that that was the catalytic event for the unraveling of her well-being, her sanity, of our family and our family dynamics, our sense of safety and security. It's become clear to me in writing, and since then, subsequently, that that wasn't the story. That wasn't actually the story. Grandma had been there as very much a buffer and a barrier, I think, and a protector in an environment where my mother had suffered from addiction and struggled with addiction long before Grandma died, and perhaps before I was born. And so I assigned her behavior to that loss. And that was a very neat way to package the way in which all of the chaos unfolded. And for many of the other adults, I surely remember vague conversations about grandma, memories that people would share, things as they would come up, but she didn't stay in conversation. You know, the way that you try to stay with your dead person, the way you try to keep them close, the way you try to talk about them so much that you remember how they sounded and what they smelled like, all of those kinds of ways that we try to stay connected to the people we've lost. My mom did some of that, and then eventually even she didn't do that. But there wasn't a lot of processing, and even just witnessing a person process the loss with any discernible pattern or clarity. It felt very much like I was sort of left to deal with it. I remember there was one conversation I'd had with a counselor in school, and I don't remember the conversation, but I remember having to have one. And I don't remember there being an outcome, or even a recurrence. But there was clearly at some point the communication that I had had this loss, and that someone decided that they should have the conversation with me. But I feel like I've lost so much of that time.
And in this conversation, talking with you, what seems to come through is almost a disconnection from your own experience because there's so much focus on your mother's experience or maybe the other adults in your life. And as you said, her substance use really accelerated or got amplified after your grandmother's death, and that the focus was on others from that place of how do I stay maybe safe in this very chaotic situation. In your book, it seems like there's a moment as an adult when you go looking for more information about your grandmother's accident where that grief really comes home. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about that.
Of course, yes. 30 years later, in fact, I I still to this day could not tell you where the instinct came from, but something in me, I was just home on the sofa. I'd come home from work. I'm sitting on the sofa watching TV, having dinner. Something just nagged at me to Google her, to search for her. I don't even know what I was hoping to find. Maybe her obituary, I think. And I didn't find that. But in that search, I wound up being led to the Detroit Free Press archives, where they had archived all of these past articles long before anything was digital. And I happened upon the article that talked about the accident that took her life. And the initial, when you see it on the screen, initially all I saw was just Detroit woman killed in a car accident or something like that, the headline. And as I scrolled down to read it, the photo of the accident was there. And so I had heard the story, a version of the story I just shared with you about how she died and what that day was like and what the wreckage was like and all of that. Her car had stalled in the center lane of the freeway, and this one car was able to swerve and miss her, but another car, and the question still remains, was the other car, was he a drunk driver? Was there some other issue? But he couldn't miss her. He didn't miss her. And that at top speed ran into the back of her car and killed her. I had heard that story and knew that story for a very long time, but seeing it, something just broke in me. I don't know. It was like at once I had been given the news, I was witnessing the aftermath of the wreckage. It was like suddenly this person who had raised me, so to speak, was gone. And it was very clear that I had not grieved at all. I don't even remember crying when she died. I don't remember crying at her funeral. I don't remember, and perhaps I did, but I think it was my instinct was to shut down all of the feelings and the emotions that wanted to come up. And I think as children don't generally have that capacity anyway. And when you don't have the environment to help you facilitate and navigate those emotions as they arise, you don't know what to do with them. Some children act out, and some children, it manifests in what people might call bad behavior. I swallowed it and just buried it, and it all came flooding back, and I just sobbed. So for hours, I think 2 hours probably, I sat there and I just cried. And I apologizing to her. I'm so sorry this happened to you. And I just couldn't believe it. Was just like, I'm so sorry. This is so horrible. And it was me, I think, officially, I can cry now. It was saying goodbye and grieving then in a way that I couldn't do 30 years before.
I'm just sitting with you as, as an adult, feeling so much of 7-year-old Daria coming through and what she
Yeah.
would have wanted to say or express to her grandmother or to her family at the funeral, to be able to be part of that mourning and that grief together. And it seems like that was not available to you as a child at all.
It wasn't. I will say the one thing I'm the most grateful for is that I could go to her funeral. I think had I not been able to do that, it would have been really, really hard. And so whoever made that decision with my mom, for my mom, perhaps it was my mom. I'm grateful. I'm so grateful because I remember that and I remember seeing her at rest. And I remember it being very strange, of course, and upsetting because everyone was so upset. But there was closure in that. And even though I wouldn't have, certainly couldn't have labeled it that way then, and I didn't know what to do with my feelings, I did have that moment of getting to lay her to rest, whatever that sort of meant to a 7-year-old. But I'm even now, I feel so satisfied that I could have that moment.
What did it mean to you and maybe in your life as well to have that grief come back in such a physical, visceral way, looking at the article and the photos and reading in the details of the accident?
Well, at that point, I was highly therapized and very accustomed to naming my feelings and naming, call a thing. And I tend to be quite good at that. So my immediate reaction was, oh my gosh, I never grieved this loss. I never made a home for it in me. I buried it. And I initially thought it might send me into some sort of depression. I thought, gosh, what's going to happen to me now? But it actually felt clarifying. It felt like this opening up. There was, I think, this very early stage of knitting together these versions of myself that I thought that I had. I thought that through therapy I had largely done that, that I had acknowledged the loss, that I had acknowledged my childhood and the ways in which we weren't cared for and what I could finally call abuse and neglect. I had really felt quite clear on all of and certain about my feelings about all of those things, even the ways in which such trauma showed up in my life as an adult and the ways in which I was working through that. And then that happened, and I was like, oh no, there's something else that I have not allowed myself to be in touch with. And I was mostly disoriented because I was like, well, why now? Why? And nothing has happened. In fact, my life is fabulous. Why now? And a therapist that I was seeing at the time, I saw her the following week after it had happened. And I told her, and I'm like, I'm ruminating over what just happened, what is happening to me? Am I losing my mind? And she so beautifully helped me understand that perhaps in all of the safety and security and stability that I had created for myself, that I was, psychically ready, that for whatever reason, my soul and my psyche decided that I could handle this next level of healing and that it was going to require access to feelings and a set of facts and the truth about those facts that I had not looked at before.
Knowing what I know about you just from reading your book, I imagine your therapist was very wise in framing it as like another accomplishment you can work on. Congratulations, all this hard work. Guess what? You win more grief.
Exactly. I know. I know. And clever woman she was. I mean, of course, I felt a little pissed off. I was like, that's not how this is supposed to work, though. Like, I've been doing the work, air quote, the work. But she framed it in a way that as I sat with it, I could really start to metabolize what that meant. And I could appreciate the fact that I did have more tools and I had a greater capacity. I felt the ground under my feet in a really different way. I had loved ones in the form of close friendships. So that I think it all made sense, even if it was wholly disorienting at the same time.
And we know that grief is not reserved just for death. There's grief for so many different types of losses and experiences. One that you wrote about that I was really drawn to was this collective grief that you witnessed growing up in Detroit in the 1980s. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about that.
Absolutely. When talking about my childhood, I wanted to give context for the Detroit that I grew up in, not just because it's great background and that helps with the character that you're learning about, air quote character, when you're reading a story, but also because I'm using it as an exploration of epigenetics, which is the study of how behavior and environment can have an impact on the way our genes are expressed. And so it became really interesting to me as I thought about Detroit, both in my own sort of frame. I for many years saw it as this hopeless place, this place where nothing good ever happened to anyone, that if you stayed, that you would never reach your potential, that you had to leave. And obviously that could be a self-fulfilling story. I could continue to lean on. But in writing the book and in giving the background, it also felt important to say how Detroit had gotten to the place that it was when I was born. And so by the time I showed up in 1980, it had been overrun by crack. There was a lot of violence and extreme poverty. A lot of the industry jobs through the automotive industry had moved, if not out of Detroit, overseas, and had been supplanted by other competitors, like a Toyota and Honda and a lot of the brands that emerged over those years. And but it's really easy to look at a person, a traumatized individual, and assign some of the ways in which that trauma manifests as a personality. But trauma at scale can look like culture. And I wanted to unpack that. And so to look at the Detroit in the 1950s, that had been the fourth largest and the richest city in the country, in the entire United States. And in just one generation, so that was when my parents were born in the 50s, by the time I arrived, a generation later, it was such a different place. And there was a collective grief, I think, that you could just feel in the community. There had been so much loss. There had been, in 1943, there had been destruction of the city at the hands of racism during the earlier years of the Great Migration. And then we saw again in the 1967 riots extreme violence and the ways in which that violence sort of decimated the spirit of the culture and the ways in which a lot of people gave up on the city, moved to the suburbs. Neighborhoods were raised and paved over, and freeways were built through them. And when you think about the systemic violence of those kinds of acts and the ways in which that can be exacted on a community, that's deep loss. And I remember just even growing up, there was still this nostalgia for a Detroit that was so different, one that was a destination for people and one that had promise and hope, one that it was the Detroit that people moved from the South and from other countries to find opportunities in. And I think that sort of just had this, there was this sort of patina of sadness and grief over the city in a lot of ways. And sometimes I still see and feel that there's still this call to a time everyone wants to get back to.
And then there's also the grief of growing up with parents who were absent, neglectful, actively causing harm, abusive, parents who at this point you've been estranged from for many, many years. And
Mhm.
how would you describe the grief of that as similar or different to grieving for your grandmother who died?
Oh gosh, so different. So different. You're grieving the loss of something that technically maybe you haven't lost, right? This nebulous grief. It's not tangible in the way that we grieve when we have a death, but there is a death. And there are so many psychic costs to growing up in those kinds of environments. Growing up with my mother in particular, my father was largely absent from our lives. It did take shape. It had a little bit more, I would dare say, process to it. And I'm so reluctant to use that word, but I can track feeling fear and then feeling shame and then feeling anger and then feeling like I didn't want to feel anything anymore. And I can sort of track that journey through my childhood and into my early adulthood with my mom. And I think that's so different also in my case because when I was in college during my first year of business or of undergrad, she sort of disappeared. We didn't know where she was. We couldn't find her. No one could locate her. And for 2.5 years, she was just gone. And so there was also the question of had she actually died? And so then it was me wanting to sort of force myself to decide that perhaps she was gone and that I needed to grieve that she had died. But in my mind, that was easier. That was easy. It was easier to perhaps explain to someone that my parents had passed away, or, you know, that then my mother has disappeared from my life. I have no idea where she is, how she is, if she's coming back, in what condition, if she does. There's nowhere to put those kinds of feelings, and that particular kind of grief I think lived with me for a really long time, even after the estrangement, because then there was the grief of the estrangement and there was the lack of ritual, of tradition, the what do I do on the holidays, I had this big milestone moment and I would love to just call this person, or I have this heartbreaking moment and I want to call this person. There's an emptiness with that. And I think it's so unique when it's your parents, especially your mother, because of the ways in which biologically we're attached, and then sociologically and physiologically attached. And I think the undoing of that, or at least putting it into a new context and having a new relationship with it, is that's been the work of my life.
When I was just sitting with this idea that when there's an estrangement or a disconnect and you share that with other people, there's other people's opinions about that. Not that there's not opinions when someone in our life has died, but to be able to say, I'm not spending the holidays with my mom because she died, that's like a concrete thing versus saying to someone, I'm not spending the holidays with my mom because we don't speak anymore. There's a lot of questions or opinions that can come with that. And yeah, I was reflecting on that in a way that I hadn't as I was reading your book. And I'm curious what that's like for you, even now, being public with your story, having your book out in the world, and navigating people's questions about the estrangement with your parents.
Well, I think because the book has only been out just a little while, the questions are still forming and emerging. I've mostly been met with understanding because the book also is providing the context for that decision. I did not imagine that that was going to be the way that it would go. I think the younger version of me who walked away from a relationship with my parents at the time thought that they might get better, that being unburdened by children, by, no longer having to care for us, that perhaps there was more space for them to find healing and to find wellness for themselves. And I think with that first, my mother had a history of disappearing from our lives. And so she, even before I have memories of it in some cases, so it had happened once in high school. It had happened again for a much longer period of time in college. So by the time I was revisiting a relationship with her, I was doing it with such fresh hope that maybe, just maybe, she's okay. She had been remarried by then. And so I just kind of told myself the story that surely she's better now. And the reality wasn't the case. And I think it was so abundantly clear then in that moment that she's unwell and I can't be in a relationship with her in this condition. It will destroy me. So I walked away very much under duress in knowing that she has yet to be able to confront the facts of my childhood, the ways in which her own struggle with addiction and substance use, whatever phase of recovery she might be in, those aren't things that my understanding, she's not been able to confront and have a conversation with and about. And so the challenge that I've had, and really the reason why we remain estranged ultimately, is because I can't live in an alternate reality where those things didn't happen, where my childhood didn't actually happen. And I know sometimes we want people to just see us where we are now, even if where we are now isn't great, but it's better than it was, or even if where we are now, it's the same, but you're not in harm anymore. I think I get that desire, but that's not, I can't be in relationship with someone, not in a healthy relationship with someone in that way. So people understand the choice to be estranged when they have that context. And, when they've read the book, it makes sense. I think also I'm finding how many more people have chosen to be no contact with members in their own family for lots of reasons. And I still absolutely have gotten versions of, but it's your mother, it's your father, these are your parents, the expectation, that the cultural expectation that it doesn't matter what they did to you. They're your parents, you forgive them, you find a way. And I don't believe in that. And I am hopeful that this story is an offering to people who are trying to find a way to be whole even when they feel broken, when they have sort of the holes that were left by these departures, estrangements, neglect, deaths, all the ways in which we experience those losses, but particularly those who have some version of loss that looks like mine, that you can you can survive it. It may be hard, and you can find acceptance. You can find compassion and empathy. You can understand a person's history and how they perhaps got where they got, but not be okay with how they exist and not be okay with their behavior. Two things can be true, and that you don't have to, air quote, forgive them. I think for me, that I really have a hard time with the idea of forgiveness, because I think that we miss the piece. There's a lot of do it for you. You forgive for yourself, but the piece that we forget is that you have to be asked for forgiveness, I believe, to actually give it. So if someone doesn't want your forgiveness for something, what are you giving it to? Where does that go? And that feels like a just something you say to feel better. Oh, well, I did it for myself. It feels better and more right and more honest and more fair to me to say that I accepted, well, I should start with I grieved the childhood that I didn't have and the parents that I didn't have, and the ways in which those losses still manifest in my life today. And I allow myself to feel sad, but I also accept that that was just the way it went. And I can also accept and grieve the fact that maybe they weren't the parents that they wanted to be, that maybe they didn't live the lives that I can't imagine that their lives unfolded in the ways that they dreamed when they were younger. And particularly in the case of my mom, I've spent a lot of time grieving the life that she didn't get to build, and the fact that I didn't get to watch it happen, that I didn't get to see the actualization and embodiment of this really beautiful, really smart, really interesting and creative person. And there's loss in that too. But I feel so much peace in being able to accept that that will always be sad.
It's a conversation that has been coming up so much in the work I'm doing, particularly around older teens, young adults, of this idea of I've had someone in my life die, and I'm also considering needing to set some limits, some boundaries, even maybe perhaps having a more formal estrangement from other people in my family who are still alive. And I think once someone has experienced a death, that conversation just gets even more complicated of this, the person who died is someone I would give anything to have one more conversation with. And I'm sitting in this place of choosing to not have another conversation with this person who is still alive. Am I going to
Yes.
regret that? So there's no answer for that. It's a very nuanced conversation. And I'm appreciating that the people are feeling more capable, or not capable, that's not the right word, more comfortable talking about that, because I think that is something that would very much live in the shadows for a long time prior to where we are right now.
And it does. I think that's it's the same duality when you make space for the parts of yourself that you don't love or that need extra love and tenderness. I somehow see them as the same idea. The more you allow yourself to feel the negative feelings, I think you make room for the positive ones as well. It all sort of expands, and you just figure out the containers that you can create for each of them. At least that's how I think a lot about it. And it is nuanced and it's difficult. And it's also doesn't have to be permanent. And I think that's the other piece of this, is that even though you have a container for both the good and the bad, and I think knowing that all you're doing is making room for your humanity. It doesn't have to be forever that you don't speak to this person. And it doesn't mean that you wait for things to change, but you keep watch and allow for the possibility that things can evolve, but accept that they may not.
I was originally going to ask you what are one or two healing practices that you've been turning to, but I'm going to shift it to say what are one or two grieving practices that you've turned to?
Well, I cry whenever I need to now. That one for sure. I think for me, not feeling my feelings was the way I managed for so many years. And so feeling my feelings is a grief practice. Another grief, it's funny to call it a grief practice, but I have not as much lately, but I do meditations where I try to come in contact with people I've lost, in particular my grandmother. And that has been a really healing grief practice, if I can call it that, in that I'm going knowing that I'm making myself available to something that may come up that may feel really sad or may feel even a bit hurtful. But I don't want to feel like I'm shutting life out anymore. I want to let life touch me. And that means allowing myself to feel devastated sometimes. And so that's been something. I don't do it generally consciously with like, today I'm going to grieve, but I certainly do it with clear intentions. And then the other thing is, I've spent so many different holidays solo. I've had a lot of solo Thanksgivings and Christmases, and sometimes they're still sad, but generally I volunteer. I'll go volunteer and try to spend my time pouring into someone else, offering what I can to someone else. And then I'll do a double header at the movies after that. And so even that sometimes feels a bit like a practice because I'm not forcing these other events. I'm not forcing these moments to look like what I think they should look like. I'm not trying to make them look like some version of a story that I can tell people what I did for Christmas this year so that they're not sad that I was home by myself, or that I went to the movies or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, those are some of the things that I do, but I love that question. I think I'll be sitting with it probably after our conversation is over.
My last question to you is about at the end of your book, you write about connecting with your grandmother and also sort of you phrase it as the love taps that you receive from her. And that's a phrase I hadn't heard in quite that way. And would you be willing to share one or two of those love taps that you've received from your grandmother?
Sure. For years, I thought it was just this cardinal that I would see outside of my window no matter where I lived. And I mean, I've lived on the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, South, you name it. And that felt like her presence to me. I had decided a long, long time ago. But several years ago, after I found the article, I started seeing her name in all of these very weird places. And my grandmother's name, for your listeners, was Effie. So, very uncommon name and just quite rare in vintage as well, and not even uncommon and modern, just this very old, rare, odd name that would show up on a box of biscuits at Whole Foods. There was this brand, and then a street in Silver Lake in Los Angeles, and the style of a sofa that I saw online. I mean, it just in the most random places. I kept feeling like she was just sort of giving me these little love taps, like I'm here, I'm here. And so whenever I see it, it happens less frequently, but it still happens where I'll just randomly see her name. There's somebody on Instagram just the other day who liked a post that I made. I don't know this person, and their handle was Effie something, and some numbers followed it. I just always kind of smile whenever that happens. Yeah, I call them love taps. They feel very much like little pings or reminders that she's here, she's with me, that she's guiding my life in some way, or at least going along with me in this journey. And it's just so comforting and lovely. And when they first started, I felt a little crazy, but it's like, these are bereavement hallucinations as far as I understand them. So what is this? So I've just decided it's just the way that we stay connected.
What a difference between phrasing it as a bereavement hallucination or a love tap from your grandmother. Very different.
Well, seeing as how I had physical evidence that it was right there. I was like, well, I'm not hallucinating, but I don't know what to call this. So I'm just going to decide that it's otherworldly.
Well, Daria, I know you're about to likely head out on many book promoting events and other elements that come with having a book out in the world of my own making. For listeners who might want to connect with you along the way, what are some of the places they can find you?
Yes, thank you. Instagram is where I keep most up to date, and I'm there at Daria Burke, and on my website as well at www.dariaburke.com.
Great. Well, listeners, I will link to those, to the website and to Daria's Instagram on our show notes. So be sure to connect there. And Daria, thank you first for your book, for having the wherewithal to put your story out into the world so that so many other people reading can connect in some way to some element of your experience, and for taking time out of a really busy touring schedule to spend this time with me on Grief Out Loud. I've really, just a lot of gratitude for our time today.
Thank you. So do I. I'm so grateful for it. It's been my pleasure. And even in the emotional moments, I'm grateful that I can be touched in this way and be able to share my story with you and with your listeners. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And listeners, you know I say this to you each and every time, but thank you for making the show mean something. I'd love to hear from you. If you want to email me, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's dougy.org. That's our main website where you can find information about local programming, all of our free downloadable resources like tip sheets and activity sheets, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Always excited to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund, and Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.